Okay, we are officially live on YouTube. Facebook, on the other hand, is giving me some problems.
Okay.
Okay, we are officially live on YouTube. And Facebook, on the other hand, is giving me some problems.
Okay.
Okay, now that we've cleared the echo. Yeah, it looks like we're just going to be live on YouTube, unfortunately.
No worries.
Okay, so to get us started, well, first off, welcome everyone who's joining us on YouTube, and hopefully will also be coming into the Zoom space. My name is Dr. Benjamin Hillskamp. I am the executive director here at Love Boldly. Really excited to have two of my good friends and colleagues with me today for a discussion about queer people of faith. Just as a housekeeping note, here at Love Boldly, we do typically record our webinars. So we will be recording during the main panel. We will then switch to off the record if there are folks who join us here in the Zoom room. Again, if you're listening to us on YouTube, feel free to come over to the Zoom space. We'd love to have you here in this space with us as well. You can find the link either from the Love Boldly Facebook page or from www.loveboldly.net/events, EVENTS. So to jump right in, could I ask our lovely panelists to introduce themselves, including what, if any, pronouns you use, and your positions, and anything else you'd like to share with us today? I am going to record.
Hi, everyone. I am Siobhan Boyd Nelson. My pronouns are she, her, and I do work in the community. I serve as the Deputy Director of Equality Ohio Education Fund, which is a C3 nonprofit here in the state of Ohio that advocates for the legal and lived equality of LGBTQ plus Ohioans. I also serve as the Secretary of the Board for Black Out and Proud, which is a nonprofit based in Central Ohio, who we elevate and celebrate the intersectional identities of Black LGBTQ folks here in Central Ohio. And I do identify as a Black queer woman of faith, and also as a lesbian.
Beautiful. Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Boyer. My pronouns are they, them. I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Programs and Marketing at Stonewall Columbus, which is Central Ohio's LGBT Community Center since 1981. So really excited to have this conversation. Going down my roster of identities, identify as a queer person, both as my orientation as well as my gender identity. I am a trans person, and I'm also someone who has a nuanced relationship with specifically the moniker of person of faith. I think that has evolved for me over time, and I'm really excited to share space to learn about what that means to Ben and Siobhan. So really excited to be here, and I'm a Pisces.
Thank you both. Zach, you, in introducing yourself, you started to touch on your faith background. So I wonder if you would start us off on kind of sharing your faith background and how you would characterize your faith today.
Oh boy, well, I'm a PK. My father I'm a preacher's kid. My father is a Pentecostal minister in a rural town in Appalachia. So I do not remember a time when being a person of faith or having a commitment to the church was not a part of my life. My father is a lay minister. My mother is also the Sunday school teacher, and we were such a small congregation. My dad was also the secretary and treasurer. My mom cleaned the church. So not only was there time spent there actually in community and in fellowship, but there also was many a Saturday cleaning the church top to bottom. And so just that relationship shifted drastically as I got to know myself a little bit better. I started exploring my faith a little bit more broadly than just what was coming from the trademark IPCC, International Pentecostal Church of Christ. A little bit more in high school. I attended my first mass, which, coming from a charismatic Pentecostal background, that was a trip because no one was talking, no one was interjecting. So for me, faith has always been not only a piece of religion, but it was my community growing up. Everything was revolved around the church, where you spent your free time, where you spent not just your 10%, not just your tithes, but that's where your money went. And that's where your time and energy went. And that shifted, starting with me exploring other versions or flavors of Christianity as a teen. I ended up becoming a part of a praise and worship team at a local, it was like the Southern Ohio version of a mega church. Like, there's no mega church because there's not even enough population to have one, let alone multiple. But in Southern Ohio, there's a few mini megas, and I was a part of a non-denominational one and part of the praise and worship team for the youth group, which was more of like, we would play covers of like Hillsong and Chris Tomlin, but like very like pop punk, because that was all of our dispositions. From there, I also was the deacon of outreach for a while with a program called the Father's Table, which was in collaboration with the Salvation Army. And so as I'm looking at my relationship and my background with faith, and for a long period of time, seeing that as in direct opposition of my queerness, in direct opposition of what my values are. But as I've been growing both as a person as well as understanding how that shaped me, because there's no other way that I could have left that life of 18 years of Sunday night, Sunday morning, Wednesday night, revival whenever the Spirit moved the minister or someone was in town. Like, you can't just say that that doesn't shape who you are. So I now see through the lens of the work that I'm doing now, the work that I've been doing prior to joining the organization at Stonewall. And much of what the biblical version of Jesus, the biblical version of Christ, that was down with sex workers and down with a community of people that were affected by a disease that sometimes were tied to identity, that's directly reflected in what I do now. The servitude toward community, the longing for community that I felt like left a hole after formally leaving the church in a formal sense. I see my faith is so much more than just Christianity. My faith is so much more than a specific deity or a way of practicing. I have now grown to understand that my faith is intertwined in who I am as a person, and it shaped my values. And though my parents might say that my values are drastically different than what they instilled in me, I see the through line. I see the direct through line of caring for community, meeting people where they're at. And instead of sinking my claws in so that they can become tithing members of the congregation, I'm now sinking my claws in so that I know that they have someone that is their cheerleader, and that they have space here. If not at Stonewall, they have space within community with me to be the most authentic version of themselves. And oftentimes I'm hearing myself talk when I'm talking with people, and I'm like, this is what witnessing was. This is what mission trips was. But now I'm doing it. And instead of like the catch of like, we need your soul, we need your 10%, it's, you get to be you. And I'm excited to celebrate what that means for people, because I wasn't able to have that. And I found that not in the way that I thought I would, but I'm grateful for what faith has done to me. As much as I'm unpacking that religious trauma piece, I'm also grateful for all of the benefits that in the way that it shaped me. And now I've talked for far too long, so I want to share airtime.
No, thank you, Zach. That was wonderful. Siobhan?
Yeah, my story actually kind of ends in a similar place to Zach's, but begins a little bit differently, but still with a Pentecostal background. Because I am also Appalachian by heritage, but was raised in Central Ohio, but primarily Apostolic Pentecostal, and very very narrow belief system, right? There is not a lot of wiggle room within that belief system, even for other versions of Christianity. So I was raised as a very judgmental person. I'm just going to say that right here. And I can say that I was taught that with the version of Christianity that I was taught. And so it was a very narrow line where even Catholics were seen as not Christian and definitely not the
A
version
different
of
religion.
Christian. It was a totally different religion. I'm now married to someone who was raised Catholic, so that was a whole discussion that we had to get figured out. And then as we developed our Christian walks and kind of blended our Christian walks together as a married couple, that was a point of tension because I'm from a Pentecostal, very loud church experience, and my wife is from a Catholic experience, but did Baptist Sunday school during the summer. And so, but still is an introvert and was very much wanted that kind of quiet Catholic experience. And so finding a church that works for both of us now, that's a fun process. But going back to how I was raised, just very narrow-minded in that Pentecostal apostolic mindset, which was then compounded by attending parochial school for 12 years. And so that is, and it was a Nazarene background to that school. So also very, very strict, very narrow, no dancing at my prom. And so we ate dinner and watched movies. That was prom for me in that. And so I grew up with a very narrow belief of what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus, to have a faith walk and to have the appropriate faith walk. And that is something, thankfully, that has expanded now. I consider myself a progressive Christian. And that is something I'm very proud of, where my faith walk is now compared to where it used to be, because there was no room in my faith of my younger years, of my teenage years, for my sexual orientation, for my identity. There was no room for people who have other relationships with God and with faith and have other traditions. There was no space just for so many things that I now have space for and love for in my life. And I will say that is because there was a pivotal point in my life where I essentially wrestled with God for the faith that I have now. And because I wrestled with God, I now have a relationship with God. And having that direct relationship with God allowed me to listen to what God was saying about me instead of listening to what other people were saying about me. And that completely changed, how I felt about faith, how I felt about God, how I felt about Jesus and what Jesus tells us about being a Christian, right? And about walking with God in our daily lives. And so much like Zach, I consider the work that I do in the LGBTQ community as part of my Christian walk. This is me living out my Christian walk day to day, because I don't believe that this is a thing that you do on Sundays or a thing that you do when you walk into a particular building or around a particular people. This is me living my life with Christ. And that tells me, like, I am supposed to be a reflection of God's love. And so that's what I try to do every day, is to reflect God's love. So if you see any light or love from me, that is literally God's light and love being reflected through me. And I feel that is my role. That is what God has put me on this earth to do. So I don't do this work because I'm LGBTQ. I don't do this work because I just have a love and I'm obsessed with nonprofits. I truly do this work because I believe that God has called me to this work.
Beautiful.
Siobhan, thank you so much for that. I really resonate when you say that, you wrestled with God and therefore have a relationship with God. That speaks to me so heavily, and really, rings true with a lot of my background as well. So thank you. I do want to acknowledge Pastor Joel Henneman, who finally got in. It looks like other folks are having some struggles joining us on Zoom. So again, I put out a few places for folks who might be struggling to get in that were also on YouTube Live. I hope that's been easier for some folks. So, going off that point that you made, Siobhan, about again, about wrestling with God, to have a relationship with God. How has your faith, Siobhan or Zach,
Yeah.
shaped who you are today and the work that you do?
Oof, I feel like it has immensely. I think that not the King James version of Jesus, but the version that I really, through using different words. Also, I had to look it up. My Sunday school teacher revealed this up with me, but I was in my head being like, wrestles with God. That was Abraham. It wasn't. It was Jacob. I had to look it up. So as I was going through, and I love the imagery you brought into the space by saying wrestle with God, because those are not words that I've used to describe my experience, but that very much is a great metaphor for that, because through that journey of rejection at some points in my life, as well as now, I feel like it's an amalgamation. I feel like I've been able to bring in so many pieces that were integral to the version of Christianity that I was raised with, but have now shaped me as a person. So putting community into the consideration with a lot of things that I do, whether it be my career or where I decide to live, like understanding that community is such a big piece of it, as well as coming from, I also am married to someone who had a different religious experience than I did, and that they were secular, to use industry Christian terms. He was secular. He went to church occasionally, but then he describes it, and I was like, baby, your grandma took you to a cult. That was in someone's living room. So he doesn't have for better or worse, some of the baggage that I hold, but he also doesn't have like why do you feel compelled? Why do you have to do that? Why do you feel like you have? I'm like, because that's what you do. That is community. And I think that some of that is uniquely comes from folks who were raised within some type of walk of faith. And for better or for worse, that has shaped, and I would say for the better, has largely shaped my perspective and my passion within both professional spaces, as well as how I spend my time and my money now. So though, again, my mom would say that we are very different and our values are on different ends of the spectrum, I feel like it's an amalgamation. I've been able to take the essence of the version of Jesus that was presented to me, and I feel like the work that we all do is that in action.
I would say that without my having wrestled with God, I would not be doing this work today. And I want to be very clear that I was completely intolerant of LGBTQ identity growing up, including my own. So the idea of actually advocating for and educating about LGBTQ identity was completely antithetical to everything that I believed about myself and about the world. And so I had to wrestle with God in order to get to a space where I understood who I was in relation to God. And I got to a point where, through my wrestling with God, said, who are you? And what are you doing? Right? Because in my entire life, I have heard that I am an abomination. Right? Because I said to God, I said, look, I know how I feel about girls. I didn't make this up. I know that this is, I felt this way since I was 8. I know I'm not making it up. It's nothing from the outside. This is who I am. So if you're my creator, why did you make me this way? Why did you make me just to hate me? That did not make sense to me. And so I asked God directly, why'd you make me just to hate me? And God's response was, who told you I hated you? And whew, I mean, that was a word right there. Who told you I hated you? Did I ever tell you that I hate you? And I think that that's where we have to cut through the BS that everyone else is telling us about who God is and who God is in relation to us. And God's question to me, back to me, was, who am I? Like, you asked me who I am, but I'm going to ask you, who am I? Who am I in your life? Who do you know me to be in your heart of hearts, in your soul? And the only thing I could say was, I know that you're my creator. I know that I was created. And for many, many years, that's all I had, was that I was created. But that was enough, because I was no longer an abomination who was damned to hell, right? Like, I finally had purpose for my life. I was a loved creation, and that allowed me to move forward in the world. And so now I'm doing this work. I'm very, okay, not even okay. I'm very affirmed and happy with who I am. I know I was created to be this person that I am, but I will say that having a faith background, having faith allows me to get through the hard days. This is not easy work. It may seem like easy work to be a queer person who works for a queer org and you just get to do queer all day. I've got the rainbow background. So, it looks super fun, and it is so joyful. And I don't know that I could do it for more than 6 months without my faith background. I call on Jesus once a day in this work to hold me through. I call out for mercy. I pray for those that I work with. I pray for those who are working against me and my community. I need folks to know that it is truly my faith that is keeping me resilient to be able to show up tomorrow to continue doing this work. And I know that sounds antithetical because of what a minority of people of faith want us to believe about faith. And it's not true. It's a lie. And we have to stop allowing them to tell the faith story because it is so much bigger and so much more open and inclusive of us as queer folks than they want us to believe.
Thank you both so much. I wish at this point I could say, here's this piece of what you just said, Siobhan, or what you just said, Zach, that resonates with me, but it all does. Yeah. And again, as I told our panelists, I wasn't going to try to comment much, but I'm really sitting on my hands here.
Oh my God, I would love to hear your perspective.
Well, I mean, for me, I'll throw out this. I grew up Roman Catholic. So I grew up in a very, very structured, very legalistic type of Christian background. Just as it seems like you may have been taught that Catholics were a different religion, the Protestants were, and Protestants meant everyone who's not Catholic or Orthodox. So your Episcopalians, your Lutherans, your Methodists, your Pentecostals, your fundamentalists, snake handling little churches out in the woods, were all Protestant. And depending on who you talked to, Protestants were either going to end up maybe in heaven if they were really, really, really good, or like the higher levels, the less intense levels of hell, simply for not being Catholic. Yeah. And for living in the United States where you should have known better. So I mean, that was my upbringing. And my family taught me in a very good, moderate to liberal white person way to see everyone as equal, and not to notice color, not to notice disability, not to notice sexual orientation or gender identity. I mean, that's how I was raised in a small, I will say Appalachian, Ohio town. But similar to Siobhan, had I not wrestled with God, with faith, and I will say, being raised Catholic, having done 13 years of Catholic education, I was wrestling as much with God as I was with Holy Mother Church and the catechism of that church. But had I not wrestled with those, I would probably be Father Ben Hilskamp now, a Catholic priest who had repressed his sexual orientation so far down that I really don't know what kind of person I would be like, but I probably would be Father Ben at this point. But it was only in my own wrestling with that I was able to first leave the Catholic Church, become Episcopalian, and then after that explore more or less Catholic ideas of faith in this kind of broadly Christian area, which has inevitably led me to the United Church of Christ. And with that, also to a very Unitarian Universalist sort of belief. I mean, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus Christ, but there are a lot of things in there, like what exactly are we being saved from? What exactly is this sin thing that we talk about, and how has sin been used to control us? I mean, these are
Yeah.
questions that I would put more in answering under the Unitarian Universalist side than some of my more devoutly or more strictly Christian friends and colleagues would necessarily hold. So in brief, that's sort of where I have come from and where I have come to now. But I've never, until today, I've never really thought about, Siobhan, what you said. I don't know 100% if I would be doing this work or not without having wrestled with the church, with faith. I definitely wouldn't be leading Love Boldly, this Christian queer organization. Would I be involved in queer advocacy? I don't know. I can tell you for a fact that had I not been gay, or had I never wrestled with that, that I also never would have gotten involved in anti-racism work, or anti-sexism, or pro-choice work, or, I mean, being gay was what gave me the window to, hey, there's also other communities that are different than you, white, cis, male Ben, that you need to explore, and that where you have massive amounts of privilege and you need to understand those. You need to understand that intersectionality. All of that was opened up to me because I happen to be gay. Yeah. And I know for a fact that I would never have gone there without having that piece and without having really interrogated that part of myself.
Ben, I will say the scarier thought for me is not just that I wouldn't be doing this work, that I might actually be on the other side of this work, actively fighting against this. Because that's what I was raised. I was raised to actively fight LGBTQ identity. In high school or junior high, we sold t-shirts that said, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And, so when I am doing this work, and we at Equality Ohio, generally, we're bridge builders. We are the folks who are willing to talk to the folks on the other side so that the rest of the community honestly doesn't have to do that work. We're the ones who are in these hard conversations with folks who are just fundamentally opposed to our identity. And I think what makes it possible for me to do that work is that I was on that side. And I understand what I believe is truly underlying some of the fervor and intensity that we see on that side. And that is a fervor and intensity against their own desires, against their own identity. And so because of my own trauma, and because I have wrestled with that, and because I know that but for the grace of God, there go I have grace for them. It is the grace that God gave me. I have grace for them and the struggles and the things that they are wrestling with, because I know it's tough. I know that it is life-threatening what we are faced with as LGBTQ folks who are raised in these strict, predominantly Christian backgrounds that tell us that we are an abomination and that we are going to hell. That is a life-threatening message to give to a young person. And so when you are wrestling against that, you are going to try to kill that in everyone else, and kill everything out there in the world that reminds you of that and that tempts you to live that truth and live that reality. So yeah, I just want to say that if I weren't on this side, the sad part is that I might be on the other side, but that's why I have so much grace for folks who are on the other side, because they are fighting a really tough battle.
So one question that I'm interested in, and I wonder if particularly some of our folks from Love Boldly and from Equality Ohio, Stonewall, elsewhere might have is, are you out in your faith community? And I'm going to add the other side of that question. Are you, for lack of a better word, an out Christian in your queer community? And sometimes, at least for me, sometimes that one can be harder than the other.
I have a pretty quick answer, and I think that I don't think that I've flat out said it, but I think I've alluded to it, is that I don't identify as a Christian, which is why when initially the conversation was framed as a conversation with LGBT people of faith, I immediately like shrunk back and was like, I'm not a person of faith. I know that and hold in my heart that I am fundamentally not tied to any specific religion. I think in my time wrestling with God, I think there was less of a wrestle and more of we got in a fight. And in my mind, in order for me as living within this mortal shell, as a trans person and as a queer person, I didn't just wrestle with God, but the version of God that was in my mind, I wasn't able to change that God. So the version of God that I was wrestling with, I killed. In me, that version of God that was instilled in me, the damnation, not only hearing it from the pulpit, but my father saying it. I had to not just wrestle, I had to kill that piece because that was a false piece. That was a false God. That was a false version of the love and the beauty that is within the universe. So for me, I do not identify or use the moniker of Christian, and to use how innately queer that I'm describing everything, and we look at the definition of person of faith or hear how someone might define person of faith, how uniquely queer that I'm like, I'm that, but I don't use that word. Like I'm trans, but I'm trans non-binary. So yes, I might be the umbrella, but this is the verse, these are the words that I use. I don't use that word. So I see that queerness immediately tied to that because I would not use the moniker of person of faith. And I wouldn't use the word spiritual either, because I think that that's been tainted with a version of self-care and love that is tied to capitalism. So I don't even use spiritual to describe myself. I view in terms of my identity, if I were to label it, if I were to say that this is how I would describe myself, it wouldn't be Christian. It would definitely be someone who I view humanity as being the piece that holds me together with my community. And largely, I view my congregation as queer people. My family is queer people. We always greeted everyone as brother or sister. And so like brother Mark, sister Karen, all of that. So in my mind, that's now that's not that there was a vacancy left by that metaphorically, but there was in terms of time and in terms of who I was spending time with. That's now been filled with my queer community and my queer family. So there is no being out, because that's innately what queerness is there's no way to be in. I guess it's more of just being more vocal about the nuances of who I am. So that's my contribution to that question. I would love to hear Siobhan's.
I love this question because I actually do find it harder to be a Christian in queer spaces.
I can't imagine.
Yeah, than it is to be a queer person in Christian spaces. And that's because number one, I'm going to choose Christian spaces that affirm my queerness and only choose those spaces. Like I mentioned, I share my faith life with my wife. And so we're walking in and we're walking in as a loving couple, the loving couple that we are. And either you fully affirm that or you don't. There is no gray area or middle ground there. And so that's the only option. So you can see I don't have a lot of grace on the Christian side. And that's because that is supposed to be a space of comfort and protection. And historically for me has been a space of trauma. And therefore I'm not going to allow it to be a space of trauma anymore. And that is a boundary that I've created for me that keeps me safe. Because despite being and defining myself as a person of faith, as a queer Christian, I will not just walk into a random church. And walking into random churches gives me anxiety, because church, it is not synonymous with God or with my faith or with the faith life that I have, right? And I'm very aware of that. On the other side, about being a Christian in queer spaces. So I'm going to walk into most queer spaces because that's what I do. That's my job. And I often walk into those spaces with people who are intolerant of Christians generally across the board. And definitely I get side-eyed for my involvement in my church. I was a board member of my church and they're like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm a Black queer woman. Why shouldn't I be a board member of the church? If it's really a church that is for me and affirming for me, then you have a position of shared power in that space. And I found that a beautiful thing. I guess what I would say is that what I want folks to know, what I want my queer family to know about queer Christians is that I want folks to get out of their head that we are all living like these silent lives of we're being traumatized every Sunday and are, choosing to walk into a space of trauma every week and do that. yes, some people are choosing to do that for a number of reasons. I get it. I understand the family stuff. I understand not wanting to lose that. Zach, you talked about that void that is created, and particularly for Black queer folks, filling that void is a whole thing and is not easily done. And so making a choice to continue to walk into that space is a choice, and it's a choice that I respect. And I want to say that that is not a choice that everyone is making. Many of us are choosing to walk into affirming spaces. Many of us are choosing to have a faith walk that does not include a quote unquote Christian or a physical space. And that doesn't make our faith walk any less, or us any less Christians, or mean that faith has any less of a part of our life. And then I don't know if you're going to get into this. I know there's like side A and side B and side C, and maybe there's an X type of thing. I will just say I think it's a side A. I had a Christian wedding with a lesbian minister who is fully credentialed. God was at my wedding. God loves that I'm married. And so does, the state of DC. So, all those things, all those things.
For anyone who might be watching on YouTube and is curious about this side A, side B, side C, side X thing, first off, as an organization, or Zach, as an organization, Love Boldly often has to talk in this language, but we're not actively opposed to it, but we were actively seeking better language. Let me put it that way, because this language is problematic on so many different levels. But the basic idea is side A is affirming. Side A is people who are on side A typically consider that God affirms LGBTQIA plus folks, affirms their weddings, affirms their ability to be ministers, to be elders, to be whatever the structure is in that denomination or that church. Basically, if the straight people can do it, the queer people can do it too. Amen. More or less. Side B is what's typically called welcoming but not affirming. We'll welcome queer folks into our space. We might let them do some things like maybe sing in the choir or volunteer for a few things. We're probably not going to let them teach our children. We're almost definitely not going to let them be on the church board or be in ministry. We're definitely not going to marry them. Although maybe a few of our more progressive ministers might do a wedding if it's like outside in a field, but definitely not inside our church. Side C is sort of the catch-all for other ideas that are kind of in between side A and side B. And side X is from ex-gay. It's people who are at the very least believing that queer people can change their sexual orientation or gender identity. At worst, it's people who are actively campaigning and running those conversion therapy, reparative therapy type programs. Again, side A, side B, side C, side X, side whatever else is really problematic language. It's very boxy. It conceptualizes things in a very kind of white supremacist sort of way. It lacks nuances that are at that intersection of faith and race, faith and ethnicity. Throw a few more words there. It's a very white supremacist colonial type approach to this, and it's not something we like to use. But as I think Zach said a little while ago, it is kind of industry language.
Thank you. I appreciate that, because we didn't have that. Because again, Pentecostal Appalachian, it was hate the sin or love the sin or hate the sin, and that was it. There is no other alternative. So thank you for sharing that, because I'm grateful that there are some folks that are inching towards side A. So thank you. Put that in my tool belt.
Well, and I would say, like, I think that's the thing. Like, I want to
Yeah.
say that the love the sinner, hate the sin type of middle ground. So we're all familiar with, what Dr. Martin Luther King said about, like the white moderates, right? Like, what are you doing? That's kind of like that white moderate position, I would say, when it comes to LGBTQ affirmation. Also, I need you to not see my identity as sin. And I need people to understand how hurtful that is. Like, you are literally looking at a creation of God and saying that God created sin when God created me in a way that sin was not created when others were created, when cis het folks weren't created, right? So this idea of love the sinner, hate the sin, no. There's a wonderful shirt that we saw at Easton the other day, and it says love the sinner, hate the sin, and then it crosses out everything but love. And my gosh, if that ain't the message, right? How about you just love? That is the message of God never said love the sinner, hate the sin. God said love and let God worry about. Let God worry about sin and whatever. All we're supposed to be doing is loving.
Exactly.
And I will add to that, as we're talking about this, being queer in Christian space or in faith spaces, and being a person of faith, Christian in queer spaces. This is one that I personally always run into as the ED of Love Boldly. The queer folks don't ever really know what to do with me or our organization, nor do the Christians. I can remember about a year, so I've been in this role for about a year now, and my first meeting with the Central Ohio LGBTQ Roundtable that both Zach and Siobhan are colleagues and contributors on. I remember introducing myself and being like, and there being nothing. It was just crickets. And that may have been that it was just the end of the meeting, but I remember sitting there thinking, okay, this is going to be interesting. But there is, I constantly struggle with that myself. I've been on dates with guys that have pretty much ended when it's like, oh, you go to church. Oh, you work for a religious nonprofit. Are you going to tell me I need to change my ways or something? Are we going to go to ex-gay camp together? No, that's not what's going on here. And I will categorically say for if I need to, for Love Boldly, we're here to affirm queer folks, queer people of faith, queer Christians. We're not here to try to change anyone. I like to say to folks who ask me that question, if you think queer folks are going to hell, then you think that I'm going to hell too. And that's not what we're preaching.
Yeah. I will also note that, so Equality Ohio loves Love Boldly as an organizational partner. And that's because, a lot of the work that we are doing, we are countering messaging that is based in faith or that has come from a very narrow faith context. And so when we are able to partner with an organization like Love Boldly, who is like, hi, we're Christians, we also affirm queer folks, we're able to, have a faith voice that is speaking directly to faith voices. I'm all about peers, speaking to peers. And that has been a very important thing. I'll also say that Equality Ohio, we understand that a lot of the work for changing hearts and minds that we have to do is in the faith space. Like that's so many of the hearts and minds that we need to change. And that if we could change those hearts and minds of faith, it'll go so far into changing other hearts and minds, into infiltrating other parts of our culture. And we do that with a very, I love that our staff is very inclusive and intersectional when it comes to faith identity. And so we've got preachers' kids on staff who work very closely with folks who are leaders of atheist and humanist organizations, right? And then they have connected us with organizations in the state who are doing interdenominational and interfaith work across the state. And so we're bringing LGBTQ identity and affirmation into these interdenominational and interfaith spaces. So even if you are not a queer person of faith, that is okay. I get it. I get the trauma. I get why you might not ever want to see a church or a person of faith again. I'm not here to witness to you. It's not what I do. I'm just going to smile at you and give you God's love that way. And also, though, I am going to ask for respect for the work that queer folks are doing in faith spaces, because it is necessary because of where we live. It's not necessary. We're not doing it just to have work to do busy work. This is a major domino that has to fall in order to get to the changes that we need to see in our society. So I think it just really is foundational work that has to be done.
1000%. I think there's a large portion of our broader queer community that doesn't have capacity, whether because of trauma or whether just because it's not their ministry. And I think that having organizations and queer people that navigate spaces of faith, I think that that is exactly it. We learn, at least I learned within my Pentecostal faith, that we all have our ministry. We all have what we were using our spirit of discernment, what God's path is for you. And I know that the work that Ben and Love Boldly are doing is not my ministry. My ministry is to be that intermediate of, I am not a Christian. If anything, if I had to use a label, it would be agnostic, but I'm able to recognize how much faith has influenced how I navigate the world. And so I view my space as being able to create that bridge for the people who are still hurt, and they see my hurt, and I talk openly about my hurts, to where we're bonded there, but then I'm able to take them to the next level of the folks who are doing this work. They are not evangelizing. I think that's the big difference, is that with queer Christians, that evangelism piece is often not there, because they recognize, oftentimes through their queer identity, that the reason that oftentimes Christians or evangelicals specifically view us as trying to recruit is because that's what they're doing. It's not what we're doing. We're creating spaces for affirmation, but we're not actively recruiting. And I think, and what I've witnessed is my queer Christian friends are no longer in that evangelical space. They're very much in the, this is my relationship with my creator. This is what my personal relationship is, which is the model that frankly, everyone should have. It's your relationship with Jesus, not my relationship with Jesus. You don't need to worry about my relationship. So I find and appreciate that there can be folks of us in the middle, that we're able to see the hurt, share our hurt, but also say, hey, as much as we want grace and space for our queerness, we need to give that for the folks that have their own personal fellowship and relationship with God. As much as we can see similarities between the people that cause harm in us, we cannot then double down and create more harm for other queer people. It's all about, you have your space, they have ours, we can coexist. The version of Christianity that you've been presented, that coexistence did not exist. That's the huge difference between queer Christian viewpoints and practice versus what we've seen elsewhere.
I love that you touched on evangelism, Zach, because I think that that is the thing that really gets to people and really turns people off about,
1,000.
you know, kind of this Christianity, the Christianity that is essentially kind of the tail that's wagging the dog right now a little bit in our country, is this evangelistic version of Christianity. And I totally agree with you, Zach. I am not in the business of evangelism any longer. It was the business that I was in. It was what I was taught to do.
Everything.
It was everything. And if you weren't witnessing, you were somehow failing, and you were responsible. Yeah, and you were responsible for the souls that you came into contact with. And so if you did not witness to this soul, and this soul went to hell, that was on your, you know, your scorecard, right? Because that was a soul that you allowed to go to hell. I think sometimes if we understand that as well, that background, that context that evangelistic folks have in their heads, it's like, oh no, I've got a giant scorecard, and I cannot let all these people go to hell that I am running into. And I love the way you said it, Zach. We have to get the focus off of everyone else's relationship and keeping a score for whether or not we witnessed to this person and whether or not they became a Christian based on our witness. I want folks to be out of that belief that that's what we're being judged for. We're being judged for what we do in our lives, the choices we make about our lives for ourselves. And that's plenty. Like, we don't need any more criteria or any more in that scoring rubric, right? And so we need to just really pare down that scoring rubric, get rid of all this stuff that has to do with other people, and be so much more concerned with who God is for us and what we're saying to him and what he's saying to us every day. and not what other people are doing in their lives.
So we are coming right up on our hour. But before we go to kind of our off the record question time, I wonder if you both could comment on just one last question. And that would be if you could say anything to another queer person of faith, queer Christian, queer whatever, who right now may be listening to this or listening to this down the road, who's struggling with faith, with being a queer person of faith. What would you, what advice, what might you say to them?
I would love to speak to the folks who feel a void that's been left behind by removing ourselves from harmful Christian spaces. I went to a Creative Babes, shout out Creative Babes event on Friday. We were in someone's backyard. There was someone playing live music, there was fire, and people were swaying and eyes were closed. And I leaned to my friend and I was like, this is youth group. This is youth group. Like, what the space that we've created here is an affirming youth group model. And I'm in love with, and I started crying because we as queer people can really translate the void that's been left with us, whether it be the ritual of sacraments. For me, during the pandemic, I really started to learn more about tarot and setting intention, not in the woo-woo way, but just in the way, okay, this card means this. I pulled it out of a shuffled deck. What situations in my life can I think more intentionally about? And so understanding that whether it's mysticism or whether it's finding almost like a youth group to attend, there are spaces and ways that we can fill that void. And it's okay for us to recognize the through line within our Christian upbringing. There is space for us to set intention. There is space for us to have ritual, space for us to have fellowship, and to speak in the cadence that I'm hearing myself speak in right now, that isn't tied to the trauma that folks might hold. That it's okay to be a guest on a panel about people of faith when that might not be the words that I use, because it would be a disservice to me. It would be, frankly, it would feel like a waste of time if I were to say I'm completely cutting off how I was fundamentally and just the essence of the 18 years of my upbringing. It would be a disservice to that amount of time and that amount of effort to completely remove myself from it and not see how we are integrating it into other spaces. So I think that's what I want to say for folks who might be teetering on that line of like, I'm not a person of faith, but I do like this and I crave the fellowship and I crave the ritual. It's okay. We do not have to be completely devoid of the things that cause us harm, because like I talked about earlier with the conversation of me wrestling with that version of God, that's just a version. Your faith and the way that we connect with things, that can still be nurtured and it can still be affirming. So don't be afraid to lean into the woo-woo, because that's what we were raised on. So why should we just leave it all behind? We can have an affirming version.
I love that, Zach. I love that. Take what feeds you and leave the rest, right? And so
Yes.
I would just really encourage people to reach out, just talk directly to God. And I know that that's going to sound a little bit crazy if anyone was raised Catholic or anything like that. But try it. I'm a definite believer that God is always listening, and if we listen, He's always speaking. And so lean into the things that I think that we all have a spiritual, we all have a soul that is connected with a higher power. Lean into that. Find what grounds you there, and also that resolution is possible. I know that if you have a Christian faith, I just want to say that resolution is possible. I don't care if you're queer, if you're trans, you are created, you are beautiful, and God loves you just as you are, and God created you that way. God is in love with you. God doesn't just love you. God is in love with you because you are God's creation. And as a creator, I just want to say that's what happens with our creations. We are in love with them, and that we all have purpose. And there is a purpose to your life. And so tap into that connection that your deepest soul, your deepest spirit has with the higher power. Find that truth that to be there. find that sense of love and hope, and then hold on to that and build from there. You only takes a mustard seed. But if you have it, if you can grab that mustard seed, you can build an entire faith life that is really going to help you with your resilience as we are dealing with the daily traumas of being queer folks in America.
Siobhan, Zach, thank you so much for your thoughts today and for being on the panel. It is our practice here at Live Boldly to dedicate some time at the end of our webinars for either off the record comment or questions from folks who are joining us. So I am going to end the recording. Okay. I know we have some folks joining us on YouTube Live. If there are, I believe there's a chat function there that I've tried to reach out to folks in. We also have one guest with us, Joelle. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for coming.
Is there anything, Zach, Siobhan, that you would like to say now that we are off the record? Or Joelle, any questions for our panelists?
Sure, I have a question. One of the things that I'm struggling with or trying to find the balance with is as a transgender person who's the pastor of a church, balancing what is life-giving and authentic for me within my own skin and who I am and who God created me to be. And I love so many of your comments that were just so beautiful about that. And what feels safe. And that's a tension that I walk every day of who God made me to be in the world and what feels safe in the world. And
yeah,
I don't expect there's a magic answer to that, but any wisdom you could share from your experience would be helpful.
We, I think at Equality Ohio, rub up against this tension because we absolutely encourage all of our staff and myself included to show up as our authentic self. And that means that we dress, we accessorize, our gender expression is very in line with our authentic selves. And sometimes we are walking into some very antiquated systems, some systems that are kind of ruled by the habits of white supremacy, and that have some very specific comfort levels and boundaries. And crossing those boundaries definitely gets into people's comfort levels. What we try to do is educate as much as we can before we enter the room and always make that education ongoing. And then always we consider ourselves kind of like open resources, but if you have a question about something that we are expressing or doing, to ask it and having that kind of open line of communication that kind of leads to education, because as folks are more educated, it has been our experience that those spaces become more inclusive and affirming. And the more we go, the more we educate and give context for things that we are feeling and why we're showing up in certain ways, the more affirming those spaces become. That's not easy for everyone. Let me say that. And I say this in my trainings, like I get paid to show up and talk about my identity and to answer questions about my identity. That's not a thing that everyone is called to do, can do, is equipped to do, right? So I just want to say that with that caveat, it's not something that everyone can do, but it has been something that we found has worked well at Equality Ohio.
I think as a trans person, and as someone who is more fluid in my gender expression specifically, I think I utilize the concept of spoons often, of like, if I have enough spoons that day, do I have it to give toward my feeling safe walking out the door with how I'm expressing my gender that day? Feeling like I have the energy to, whether it be a cat call, whether it be a drive-by faggot, if like it's where it's like you can't quite hear the slur, but you kind of hear and I know what's happening. But there's also the other end of it where folks think they're affirming and ooh, you're just looking sassy today, or like, ooh, love the XYZ today. And it's like, I just want to exist. I want to be in the space and exist. So I think as someone who navigates both the androgyny and femininity and masculinity that I feel innately tapped into, I sometimes will just try to give myself a little bit more grace of like, today's a hat and a flannel day. I don't have it in me to answer questions. I don't have it in me to be looking over my shoulder. I don't feel like being hyper vigilant today. So I think coming into those spaces where innately our identity and how we're showing up, how we look when we show up, how that can then, in my mind, as someone who does LGBT education and going into these spaces, I have to determine, do I want to feel comfortable today? Or do I want the message that I'm giving to be received because people are going to see me instead of hearing me? And I give myself grace, and I say to myself, today's not the day. Today might not be the dress day, even though I want to wear the dress. Today might not be the dress day because I don't have it and I don't want it in terms of that additional effort. And it doesn't make me any less trans. It doesn't make me any less queer if I show up one day in one kind of expression, or one day I'm very vocal about talking about my identity. I'm still holistically who I am. If I'm silenced and I'm not talking about my identity when I'm in a space, it doesn't negate any of who I am. So just giving yourself grace to say, today I have it in me. And especially for those days where today you might not have it, just being kind to yourself.
I love that,
That's,
Zach.
that's really, really helpful. I guess I haven't always had that language of the spoons, but I do that in practice. And I'll confess, I often then beat myself up for not showing up as my full authentic self. So I really like what you said about showing yourself grace.
Exactly. Showing yourself grace, as well as like, for me as someone who, whenever I am expressing more feminine, I start critiquing and I start saying like, well, that's not very womanly and that's not this and that's not that. But I'm blessed to have so many different examples of womanhood in my life, to where I can look at whenever the intent is to exude femininity, and if I'm feeling feminine, I want that to be exuded in my expression. As soon as I start nitpicking and I think, well, so-and-so's flat-chested, so-and-so doesn't have a butt, so-and-so doesn't have, like, womanhood and femininity and whatever level of gender expression is so nuanced. And sometimes we're our harshest critique when we're trying to, I don't want to say perform, but oftentimes whenever the intention is for something to get across, if it's not quite there, I start beating myself up, or you might do that as well. Just giving the grace that we want, the grace that we give to others, we need to be able to give ourselves.
And all those things to me are such cishet standards.
Exactly.
And yet it's so easy for us to fall into them. And I'll just finish one thought and then I'll shut up. You know, looking, if I scroll through my Instagram and see other transgender women who are so beautiful, you know, it's easy for me to say, oh, why can't I look like her, you know, type thing, which is unhealthy and just feeds into
it's hard.
These societal expectations of beauty and womanhood. But thank you both for all that you offered.
Of course, and thank you for sharing that, because I think that that's often something that as trans people, we know is happening, but we don't get to talk about it or have space to talk about it, especially when it comes into spaces of leadership. Because oftentimes, as I touched on earlier, I don't want the message that I'm coming into a space to bring. I don't want my mortal shell to be over speaking, but also I'm allowed to take up as much space as I want. So in the days where you might not have the spoons, but also even if you have the spoons and you're starting to think, well, I don't want this to outspeak this, take up space. We are allowed to take up space. And there are some days where if it is going to be more beneficial to express ourselves in our gender expression, how we feel most affirmed, if someone's not going to get that message, that person wasn't going to get the message, period. If one little barrier is going to stop that person from listening to me, to listening to, here's my decade, here's my CV, if they're going to let my mortal shell overspeak for that, that was that person's heart. That wasn't you. And so if it feels like you have it and it feels affirming, do it. Take up the space.
So I haven't gotten any other questions in. So
Okay.
before we wrap up, Siobhan, Zach, is there anything else you want to add, particularly for our folks joining us on YouTube?
I'll let you go first.
I'm a big person about active allyship. And so I guess for those folks who are cishet folks in the church, that
Mhm.
you have work to do, and that there are folks within the church who are there in a space of historical trauma. And like, so just
Mhm.
understanding that when queer folks are showing up in a church space, they have done a lot of work to get to that space where they can walk into a church and feel good and be in a headspace where they can actually have a connection with God and not be distracted by, historical traumas and all those different things. And so I would ask for allyship from cishet folks in the church, an active allyship, not just, hey, happy Pride Month, but, actively working and affirming LGBTQ identity in ways that matter
Mhm.
and in ways that we show up for other marginalized communities. The church is the original nonprofit. The church was the original food bank, right? And so the church was designed to care for marginalized individuals. Therefore, it is my belief that it is the work of the church to care for LGBTQ individuals, not just to welcome them in, not just to affirm them, but to be actively caring for a marginalized community that is facing
Yes.
poverty, that is facing housing insecurity, that is facing food insecurity at ways that are totally disparate to our cishet peers. So that's my parting call is for active allyship of affirming churches. It's not enough to put a statement on your website. It's not enough to smile at the queer members of your congregation or to give them seats of power within your hierarchy. You also have work to do as part of your Christian walk to be, caring for this marginalized community.
And I want to double down on that. I think that active allyship needs to be, instead of it presenting like, oh, we did this for the LGBT community, you need to be in community and you need to create things that are reflective of actual needs. You need to listen to the queer people in your congregation. And it's not just well, we're doing this because we saw this other church doing it. You need to find out what the queer people from your congregation and your community are needing and what they're wanting. Because the alternative to that is just hollow, you're just throwing things. I also want to speak to understanding that a lot of folks that hold trauma within LGBT identities from the church, I think there is a level of humility that especially cishet Christians need to take within that, and understanding that it's not about you. This is a systemic issue. This is a larger issue. Stop making it about you. Stop making it about, well, I don't like it when they say that. Oh, well, we have earned the right to be critical of the church. We have earned the right to be critical of the perpetuated misogyny, trans misogyny, racism that are built into many church systems that are continually being perpetuated at a tax-free rate. So understanding that we are allowed to be critical, we've earned that place to be critical, and you need to humble yourself and just understand that we're not just saying this because we're angry. We're saying this because this has shaped us, and for better or for worse, many ways. So understanding that when it comes to there being some reluctancy of, I don't understand why that LGBT group doesn't want to work with us. We're an affirming congregation. Well, just understand that that's how it is. Have some humility and understand that not everyone is going to want to partner with you. And that's not to discredit the work that you're doing at all. That's just to say you need to give people the space that they have, because whenever we're moving into, I don't understand why they must collaborate with us. That's, again, an evangelistic colonizer mindset, and understanding that we need to dismantle that. As much as white people need to be doing the work within anti-racism work because we created the problem and we need to be the solution and have those conversations, cishet folks within the church, you need to have this conversation. You need to be the ones who are listening to queer people.
And I want to, something that Zach said reminded me of something that my wife says. And it's so it just so applies here. 2,000 years of history means that we don't have to give you the benefit of the doubt as queer folks, right? So we have 2,000 years of church history oppressing and marginalizing the queer community. So when your church that is affirming and has a beautiful statement on its website and flies a pride flag, walks up to Stonewall, walks up to another queer organization and says, hey, we want to partner, it's a yes, right? No, it's not an automatic yes. You don't get the benefit of the doubt. We need to see active allyship. We need to see your programs meeting the actual needs of the community and not your needs for altruism. And you don't get the benefit of the doubt and you're not going to get it. And that is 2,000 years of history behind that. And so don't get your feelings hurt. Just do the work.
1000%. And when you're entering LGBT spaces, understand that there's a level of, you need to understand the space that you're taking up when it comes to, and I know that I'm representing an organization, so I'm going to choose my words wisely, but if there are large celebrations that are LGBT focused, understand that it's not about you. Understand that I'm sure those organizations hypothetically really appreciate your contributions, but that doesn't mean that we need to bend over backwards for you in ways that we're not doing our own organizations within our community. So just be mindful of the space that you're taking up.
Well, thank you both. Jean joined us right at the end. I didn't know if she might have questions that she wanted to ask.
Jeannie, are you still on there? If you're asking a question, you're muted.
I did not want to ask a question. I apologize for joining late.
That's all right. Thank you for joining.
Worries
I
at all.
Appreciate it.
Well, Siobhan, Zach, thank you so much for being with us. I'm sorry that we had kind of a wonky tech setup, but I hope that our folks on YouTube Live had some good content. Just as a note to you both, we will put the recording up of the panel part of our discussion on the website. So feel free to direct anyone over there. That should be up in the next week or so. But I'll let everyone know and put it out on social media when that happens.
I love that. And I just want to say thank you, Ben, for creating this space. I feel like I often don't get to talk about my faith background and just being able to, one, I've done a lot of introspective work, but to be able to have community and talk with other folks about it has been really affirming. So I just want to say thank you for creating this space.
Same, Ben, I'm a big fan of Love Boldly. Thank you for the invitation, the opportunity, and for continuing to lean into conversations like this, because they're so necessary. We got to keep having so many more of them.
Agreed. And now I feel like I need to, after learning that you also are a Pentecostal kid, I need for Karen, me, and you just to have, I cannot wait to talk about the conferences. I can't wait to talk about Feast of Ingathering. I can't wait to talk about all these things.
Well,
I love
anyway,
it.
thank you both.
Love it.
Sorry.
Have a lovely day.